Thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be here. Like Chris said, I'm Nitya Verma. I'm from IU Indianapolis. Today, I will be presenting this paper that is a qualitative field study, and it examines the data practices in the law enforcement context on behalf of Lynn, Dombrowski, and myself. Thank you so much for being here. So, as many of you know, in the United States, law enforcement agencies are under intense social scrutiny because everyday citizens are having concerns around racial bias, lack of police oversight and accountability to the communities that they serve, as well as lack of training for these police officers. To address these concerns, the Obama administration launched specific data initiatives for the police to help understand what's going on and help them use data in order to increase transparency, build community trust, and strengthen accountability. These initiatives are trying to support the police do a better job and be able to demonstrate it to their communities. So these initiatives are optional, and as of 2016, about 30% of the population in America is impacted by these initiatives, including our case site. So as researchers and scholars, we know that data alone cannot solve these kinds of social problems. We understand that data is political, it's not neutral or objective, so we respond to the calls that we have seen in scholarship to address questions around the experience and politics of data. So in this research, we aim to study the human experience of technologies and data, as well as trying to understand the challenges around using data. So one of the key findings here is that these data-driven strategies are not friction-free. They create their own set of challenges for police stakeholders. And before we get to those challenges, we do need to cover some background information. So police in the US are guided by different policing philosophies. Two of these philosophies that we're going to talk about in terms of this paper are traditional and community policing. So traditional policing model in that police are more reactive to crime rather than trying to stop crime, whereas in the community policing orientation, they're more proactive because they're trying to understand why crime exists in the first place and prevent crime rather than just reacting to it. So we contribute to this work by demonstrating the different ways these philosophies are part of being data-driven and the tensions between these two approaches in policing. There's a lot of technology and data integrated into the work of police organizations, whether that's reporting from on-the-ground officers in their patrol cars on the laptops, or the chief of police using data to make decisions around resource allocation, or simply using data to aid investigations. Data and technology in policing is pervasive, and scholars have raised concerns about the impact of computerization on police work and what that means for community outcomes, which leads us to this section of literature on data-driven policing. So data-driven policing refers to decision-making processes and evidence-based strategies to understand crime problems and allocate limited resources with greater effectiveness. As I'm sure you're aware, police have limited resources, and the promise of data-driven technologies is that it can help them better allocate their limited resources. So there are several components to data-driven policing. That includes community partnerships, measuring outcomes, sharing information, as well as several benefits. Some scholars even claim that by implementing data-driven policing, technology can eliminate undesirable biases to introduce more fairness into decision-making. But as data and technology scholars, we know that data can perpetuate and confirm biases. Big data stands to reproduce inequalities by exacerbating the experiences of marginalized communities. So we contribute to this literature by identifying the challenges that are faced by the adopters of data-driven policing. So why does HCI matter here? Precisely to think about the experiences around data. So while we as academics know that data is politicized and not free of bias, the police don't. These technologies are marketed as enablers of objectivity, accuracy, and truth in order to provide increased transparency and accountability and help them legitimize their decisions. Because of that, police are unaware that data carries certain agendas and narratives depending on how the data is collected, analyzed, and disseminated. For instance, we know that the more an area is policed, the more arrests are made, but that doesn't necessarily mean there are more convictions. And if data is used to predict where police should patrol, it stands to reproduce and confirm the same inequalities that already exist within marginalized communities. So here we address the calls to pay more attention to the nature of how these biases play out in implementation with this project. So all this literature opens up the research questions. What are the experiences of the officers who are implementing data-driven policing initiatives, as well as what are the challenges and impacts of data-driven tools and practices for these police agents? So to look into this, we recruited participants from our case site, which we refer to here as the Midwest Metropolitan Police Department, or MMPD for short, which is the law enforcement agency of one of the most populous cities in the Midwest. Their mission focuses on reducing crime and the fear of crime while enhancing public safety. They have about 1,600 police officers in their workforce. So methodologically, we conducted 16 semi-structured interviews, which lasted about 100 minutes on average. And our participants included data analysts, on-the-ground officers, detectives, lieutenants, sergeants, in various different capacities and positions. On top of that, we also conducted 55 hours of observations where we attended community police meetings, public safety meetings and training sessions, as well as accompanying police on their patrols to understand their work's context better. This data was analyzed iteratively and inductively. So for the rest of the presentation, I'll give a brief overview of the 3 key challenges in MMPD's data-driven effort. The first one is data-driven frictions in how the police envision their socio-technical futures and their own roles within the communities. The second category of challenges is precarious and inactionable insights. And then lastly, the challenge that we talk about is around concerns about police's experiential knowledge. So ultimately, these challenges shed light on how this police organization is navigating new work possibilities with data and how these challenges can hinder police work as well as accountability. So within MMPD, there are strong disagreements about how to use data to address the social concerns. The first way they use data aligns with a traditional reactive policing orientation that we talked about earlier, where it helps police legitimize their decisions or cover their butts, as well as help them get public support. So, with data, we get more buy-in, we get more support. I think that's an effective result of data because the community gets more objective statistics from us now. So a key concern here is who is collecting the data? How are they collecting it? How is it being analyzed, presented? What does the data depict and what does it leave out? Data or more data by itself does not necessarily mean more transparent and accountable police forces. And then the other way to use data is not just to legitimize decisions, but rather understand why crime is happening and trying to be proactive in their communities, where police officers are not just focusing on enforcing the law, but looking at why crime exists in the first place. So one of the ways they do this is they map out the city, as well as the underlying issues like mental health issues, drug addiction, social instability, and other reasons as to why crime exists through a tool called the Social Disorder Index. So these officers are creating maps of the city to understand what kinds of crimes are happening, where, and why. So here we have an officer saying, you have to have all 3 things, offender, victim, environment, to have the crime occur. If we take away any part of that triad, then we don't have the crime. So SDI data, Social Disorder Index, starts building a better, bigger picture of how that convergence setting is created. However, there are frictions between these 2 orientations, between being reactive and proactive. So here a detective argues that policing organizations are not trained to handle solving underlying social issues in proactive manners. So with our resources, we're just not designed to handle public prevention. Social services are looking at the disease. We can just see and respond to the symptoms. So on one hand, it's clear that several police officers don't see being proactive as viable and even beyond the scope of their work, while several officers do. And they also see it as the future of policing. And they're trying to become more proactive than reactive. So while using data can lead to certain kinds of insights that are evidence-based, our second data challenge deals with how these insights can also be precarious and inactionable for these police officers. The police that we talked to experience this in two ways. First, faulty inferences from being data-driven, as well as the inability to implement these decisions because of lack of resources. So, for example, one of the police detectives talked about that it's really difficult to allocate resources through crime data. As you can imagine, when there is more crime in areas, they start to patrol that area. Turns out that criminals are smart, and when they notice more police, they change where they commit crime. The faulty inference here is that crime is static, but it's not. So these decisions about where to put the police officers based on data can be problematic. So here, the key takeaway is that data cannot predict crime, and it's really difficult for police commanders to predict where crime will pop up. And these concerns around data-driven insights are also in part because certain commanders lack the data literacy to understand that data cannot predict future crime. And then lastly, the third challenge we saw in our data is around police's experiential qualitative knowledge, or what we refer to here as metis. Metis means practical knowledge, gut instinct, experience, knowing how and when to apply the rules of thumb in concrete situations, and this is often grasped through experience instead of being explicitly taught. And as HCI researchers, we care about people's subjective experiences of technology, how their knowledge is impacted and understood in the tools that they use. So our police participants were quick to temper data with their subjective professional expertise. So here, crime analyst is talking about how we cannot collect a God's eye view of data and police. We cannot take all threats and all incidents and then put them into one predicting police formula. We need worker bees on the ground that take these incidents and analyze them from not only a data perspective, but a human intel and intention perspective as well. In the same vein, another officer talked directly about how more data or more quantitative data doesn't make for a more accountable police force or better community relations. So when it comes to the older officers, face-to-face, boots on the ground, real old-fashioned investigation will always trump technology. Data is just a supplement. What I actually worry more about is the younger officers who start relying on technology so much. So here's a problem that we as HCI scholars are well situated to deal with, which is how do we help these police think through their experiential knowledge in relation to the data use? Their experience, gut instinct are vital to the work that they do, and these police don't feel that these systems are accounting for their metas. So how could police experience be better integrated and shaped into these data systems? So to move on to the discussion and the implications of this work, we know that data is not going to be neutral. Data use is not going to be apolitical, and data is likely not going away. And as police come under fire about the negative impacts that they have on marginalized communities, data and technology stand to drive decision-making and guide police actions. So specifically for design implications of data-driven technologies, we recommend designing for information transparency, which is defined as a pre-existing condition for accountability, because this establishes and renders visible how the data is created and used for decision-making. Of course, such changes will not eliminate data bias, but presenting information about how the data was produced and by whom may provide an evidence or may provide an awareness of factors that shape data to the end user. So based on these results, as we were trying to think of ways that could possibly mitigate the impact of biases and politics of data and encourage transparency, we proposed in this paper figuring out how to develop and sustain community-driven data practices. This might be a constructive way forward to involve community stakeholders as accountability and data practices are being developed in terms of data collection, analysis, and reporting. Currently, the community is presented with data as an end product of police work. However, if data is going to help support and legitimize police work and improve these relationships, the data should be shaped in collaboration with the community instead. So we imagine this kind of collaboration could pull in various community stakeholders, but we're also aware that there are barriers to entry for this idea, whether that's trust to be around the police for certain groups, or data literacy that could inhibit certain community members from participating. But again, community-driven data practices could possibly help us explore how to mitigate these social issues around police accountability and their data use as we move forward. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions at this point.
So we have time for 2 or 3 questions. If anyone wants to come forward to the front.
Hi there, Eric Balmer, Lehigh University. Really interesting stuff. I want to ask about what constitutes data here, because it seems like it's playing a bunch of different roles in the analysis. I suspect it's something that's teased out more in the paper and gets glossed for the talk, so I'd love to give you a chance to talk about the relationships between like the crime report stats data that the police use to do their predictive patrolling versus the outcome stats that they present to the community, and the way that those are all viewed as data under one kind of umbrella practice.
Right. And that's a great question, because data in policing is an amalgamation of a lot of data that they're getting, whether that's the data that they collect or it's out on social media, or even the federal government where they have these data partnerships and they're using that data. So if I understand your question correctly, here data is more of a multifaceted, like socio-technical thing that's happening within this organization. And I think in our conversations, it felt like the police are also sort of wondering, what is data? Because, right, like because obviously they're qualitative, their metis is data to them, but the way that these technologies represent data don't necessarily legitimize their metis.
Yeah, there's something really interesting about members' definitions there. Thanks.
You're welcome.
It's a great paper, thanks. Amy Berkman from Georgia Tech. I'm wondering if there is enough interest for us to do a SIG on HCI and policing, maybe at CHI, or maybe even if the call is still up at CSCW in the fall. I think there are a lot of hard-earned lessons in this kind of work. We're working on using big data to help combat human trafficking. And I think there are a lot of hard-earned lessons about working with police and fascinating things about it that it would be fun to share. My question is that some of our police informants will tell us that they are overwhelmed with being reactive to public complaints. The public complaints are typically not about important things. They're about nuisance things. And if they spend all their time responding to nuisance things, they can't use our wonderful tool that we've built for them to go after the deeper problems that could really help. So I guess in the end, this is a resource allocation problem. How can we, as the HCI community, influence the conversation about resource allocation with law enforcement?
That's a really good question. So in my ongoing research, I'm also working with activists in the community, and I do feel like from their own different standpoints, they do kind of end up saying the same thing in terms of there are a lot of things that we shouldn't be calling the police for. It's not really helpful to the community, as well as it's not really helpful, like the police can only do so much. They don't have a lot of jurisdiction on a lot of like these civilian conflicts that come up. I'm not sure what the answer is to that, but I do feel like that was, our participants also echoed the same sentiment in terms of they're overwhelmed. They don't have enough resources even in terms of manpower. So like one of the concerns was that even if data is going to help them be predictive and, you know, like tell them that you should go here, if they don't have enough people, then what does the prediction really mean?
Hi, my name is Tammy Gubarek. I'm at the School of Information at the University of Michigan. Really interesting work. I'm really interested in your recommendation to be more transparent. about the production of data. And I'm interested to see if you learned kind of what that kind of transparency communication would look like what exactly should be communicated, and then what kinds of impacts you believe that would have on the kinds of decisions that are being made on the basis of the data.
Yeah, so I feel like, so this was part of the analysis. We didn't necessarily talk a lot about transparency directly to our police members, and I do feel like from the community perspective and from the policing perspective, because there isn't really a standardized definition of what transparency is or what accountability is across our nation, it's something that I feel like is contested widely, where the police, believe that, yeah, we're transparent, look at all this data that we're giving you. And then the community is like, well, what does this really mean? So